Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, MPs are back at Westminster. They're currently discussing refugees from Burma. Shortly, Brexit Secretary David Davis is expected to update them on progress in Brexit talks. We'll be bringing you that when it happens. But first, could 5 million public sector workers soon be getting a pay rise? Pressure is growing on Theresa May to drop the 1% public sector pay gap. And in the last hour, Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, announced the SNP will do just that.
I can confirm that we will lift the 1% public sector pay cap. The pay cap, while never desirable, was necessary to protect jobs and services. However, with inflation on the rise, it is not sustainable. Our nurses, teachers, police officers and firefighters deserve a fairer deal for the future. Indeed, the need to recruit the staff that our public services depend on also demands a new approach.
That's what's happening in Scotland. What about here? Let's speak to Guardian columnist and author Owen Jones and The Sun's Westminster correspondent Harry Cole. Hello to you, gentlemen. Thank you both for joining us on Sky News. Interested to hear you making the case, I'm guessing, for and against this pay cap. Let's go to you, Owen, first of all. Latest I was reading was suggesting that it would cost £9 billion a year if it was lifted.
Well, look, let's be clear firstly, we're not talking about a pay freeze, we're talking about a real terms pay cut, because when you take into account inflation over the last few years, the pillars of our society we all depend on have experienced pay cuts of up to 14%. Now we're talking about the teachers who train up, educate the next generation, who the long-term future of this country depends on, the firefighters who risk their lives, as they did at Grenfell Tower just the other week, whether it be the nurses who look after us when we're sick, and many of us have ill relatives who depend on the love and care and commitment of those people. Now, what we've seen during this economic crisis, which was caused by those at the top of society, the financial sector, is those who had least to do with it were expected to pay. Now, there is the money there. The wealth of the richest 1,000 people more than doubled during this economic crisis. So if we ask those at the top of society, who are doing very well indeed, just to pay a bit more tax and to reverse corporation tax back to where it was in those socialist-heady days of 2011, then we will have the money to ensure that those we depend on most as a society have the money they need. And just on that, it's a practical point as well, because if you end up with their salaries declining and falling, then many of the best won't become teachers, for example, or you get people leaving, fleeing those professions, and will all suffer as a consequence. It's the right thing to do for them, but it's the right thing to do for all of us.
Harry Cole, it's a no-brainer.
Oh, I think the pay cap's dead in the water. You know, Labour have been opposing it for 7 years. No one really, I don't think, really expected it to last this long. And what's interesting now is the parliamentary makeup. The fact it's now Tories who are leading the charge against the pay cap. We've got nurses like Maria Caulfield who are leading the protests for nurses to get a pay rise. We've got people calling for soldiers to get a pay rise. And I think the writing's on the wall for it. Philip Hammond, I mean, it's a little bit more complicated. It does have to go through an independent sort of scrutinising body. But if the Chancellor was to encourage them to suggest a rise, then I think that's almost certainly what's going to happen. And I think we're going to see this more and more in this Parliament. And the fact is that it only really takes a dozen or so Tories to demand a change in policy, and suddenly the parliamentary arithmetic is not on the government's side. So Philip Hammond may be feeling that he's being slightly bounced into this, but I'm not sure he's got much choice.
Owen, stealing a march then on your leader, if you will, in the form of Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, I agree with what Harry said there. The parliamentary arithmetic means that the Conservatives are in a very weak position. But let's be clear, this is not a Tory-led charge, because, you know, if the Tories had won that overwhelming majority that they declared an early election, didn't they, to wipe out the opposition as a viable electoral force, if that had happened, then we wouldn't have any talk whatsoever of the pay cut, the real terms pay cut being lifted. Instead, what we'd be having is the reintroduction of fox hunting and the introduction of a dementia tax, and also the confiscation of free school meals, and we certainly would still have the public sector pay freeze. The reality is the Tories, of course, you know, they lost their majority. But you know what? To be sympathetic to the Tories, I think what's happening is there's just a shift in attitudes. The ideology that a lot of Tories have promoted, have existed to promote for a very long time, which has said we need to slash public investment in the economy, slash taxes on the rich, have a small state, if you like. That ideology is kind of on the ropes at the moment, and increasingly people are turning against it. Just like back in the 1970s, Labour was trying to defend the old post-war consensus of Attlee, strong unions, public ownership, higher taxes on the rich, when that's falling to bits. I think what we're seeing similarly today is the consensus that Thatcher established is looking a little bit ropey right now.
OK, take that then, Harry Cole, and a bit of fox hunting in there as well to give you a bloody nose. But how are we going to pay for it?
Well, that's that is Philip Hammond's big complaint, isn't it? I would pick up just a few things that Owen has said there. This idea that it's a Labour charge that is leading these reforms. It's not. If you look at who was actually calling over the summer for a change to the pay cap, it started out with the MOD. It moved over to the Home Office. It moved over to the Education Department. These are cabinet ministers sitting around the table, people actually able to do things rather than just go on protest and write whinging columns. But how do we pay for these things is the eternal dilemma of any chancellor, and Philip Hammond's got some serious sums to do.
Well, you heard what Owen suggested, that the rich need to pay more in taxes.
I think that's the only thing I've ever heard Owen ever say. But corporation tax cuts rises at a time when we're trying to encourage international trade don't really make a huge amount of out of sense. If we're trying to encourage people to come to this country and invest in this country after we leave the EU, then putting up corporation tax would be a pretty daft idea, in my view.
Owen?
Well, we'd be putting corporation tax back to where it was in 2011. Actually, it'd still be one of the lowest levels of any industrialised country, even if we went back to that level. I have to say, the idea this is a Tory charge is for the birds. In the manifesto, the Labour manifesto presented in the last general election, committed explicitly to ending that freeze and giving nurses and teachers and firefighters, reversing their pay cuts. If it was for the fact that Tories had won that majority, nobody thinks seriously that there'd be any change. I mean, you can say whingy columns and other slightly childish comments. I mean, the difference is, I suppose, at the end of the day, I'm an opinion writer and I write opinions. Harry Cole is also an opinion writer. The difference is his opinions go in the news section rather than the opinion section, which says a lot about the way the press works. But at the end of the day, I would put it to Harry that the things he believes in passionately, which he's entitled to do, even though he's supposed to be a news reporter, those things are being challenged, because the things which you don't like lower taxes on the rich, so you do like lower taxes on the rich, public investment in the economy, well, people, have changed their minds on it. People do think that public sector workers should have more money in their pockets. They do believe we should invest more in the economy. They do believe we should have higher taxes on the rich. And the problem with the Tories at the moment, strategically, almost to get a bit sympathetic about them, is they're stuck in caught in a trap, to quote Elvis Presley. Either they double down on an ideology which is increasingly rejected by people, or they concede to the argument of Labour, and then they start legitimising the arguments of Labour. If they start doing that, then people go, why don't I just vote for the real thing? If public investment is a good thing, why not vote for Labour? So they're in a bind.
OK, not much love between you two, though, is there, baby? Harry, you were saying?
So, say that again, sorry, Kate?
Yeah, you were going to come back, I think, on what we were hearing there from Owen, and I was trying to be clever with my pun on Elvis Presley, which fell on the floor.
Yeah, no, the Tories are caught in a trap.
Sorry about that.
The Tories are caught in a trap, and it is a trap of their own making. But Theresa May started out when she came into power saying she wanted to help those poorest in society, those that have been left behind. And in a weird way, the election sort of deviated away from that, and suddenly we weren't getting that message from Theresa anymore. Suddenly it was just strong and stable, strong and stable. And there is a real view, I think, in the next few weeks that the Tory party want to get back into that domestic agenda. It's not just all about Brexit, but they do want to start, living up to those promises that Theresa May made on the steps of Downing Street, that she does want to build a country that works for everyone. So the idea that suddenly the Tories weren't talking about that before the election isn't quite accurate. But we'll see how it goes. Frankly, this is all a sideshow, because Brexit is the only real story in town, and everything else is gonna struggle to get any cut through.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly was it was certainly in the manifesto, was it not, that this pay cap would be done away with should Labour win the election. But also they said that they would do away with tuition fees, and then it transpired that actually that probably wouldn't happen. So just because it's in the manifesto doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to happen.
I have nothing but respect for you, as you know, as a journalist. But I would just put it to you that the Labour commitment was to end tuition fees from this September. It wasn't to eradicate tuition fees. And I have to say, that whole attack, that desperate attack, and it's the same with Venezuela, it doesn't land. People aren't convinced by it. There was never any commitment to abolish tuition fees, as in to abolish existing tuition fees.
Go on, Harry.
There was, in the Labour manifesto, however, there was a commitment to leaving the single market and the customs union and having maybe a workers' first Brexit, but a Brexit that it was very similar to the ones the Tories turned. But yet today, just an hour ago, the Labour Party have ripped that up now and are doing everything they can to derail Brexit. Isn't that a bit of a manifesto breaking?
No, because what the manifesto said was to retain the benefits of the single market and the customs union.
Which is
the
whole
whole Labour argument. But the whole Labour argument was that if you like, whether we stay members of the customs union or single market was secondary to that aim. So the argument of Labour, and I have to say this is a Tory mess. You know, they called a referendum for partisan reasons. They called a snap election. They called a snap election to crush the opposition, which wasted negotiating time and left us a laughing stock with the very governments we need to negotiate a deal with. Labour now has to propose how they deal with that. So that argument is, yes, to keep the benefits of both. That may mean remaining members, particularly the customs union, or the single market. They're saying within a transitional deal that's necessary, because the idea of a bespoke deal being done in the next 18 months, given the mess the Conservatives have made of Brexit negotiations, is simply not going to happen. I think that's a pragmatic view. I would like to stay in the customs union, the single market, incidentally, but really? I think the point Labour are making, and there was a shift, I think, going on in terms of wider thinking, not just across the political spectrum, is that given we're approaching a cliff edge, which has terrible consequences potentially for our economy, let's have that for a transitional period and then maybe keep it for the long term. Can you just
answer me one more question, Owen?
Really quickly?
In July 2015 did Owen Jones suggest that the left should own the Eurosceptic movement and the left should campaign to leave the EU? Talk about changing your tune.
Listen, gentlemen, I'm going to carry on with my Elvis analogy. We can't go on together with suspicious minds, but we might be back after the break. Stay there for now, if you would. We'll see you in just a second here on Sky News. Tried to get rid of them, we couldn't. They're still here. Guardian columnist and author Owen Jones and Sun's Westminster correspondent Harry Coles, both still standing by. Still waiting to hear from David Davis, the Brexit secretary. But while we're waiting for him, first this time to you, Harry, if I may. We heard from the chairman of the 1922 committee today, basically not supporting the Prime Minister, saying she's in her job for now. How much longer has she got?
It was a beautifully diplomatic performance by Graham Brady. He said that while the Prime Minister is safe, she's only safe for as long as her colleagues were. It was a gentle reminder that, in fact, the Prime Minister can fly to Japan and say that she wants to go on and fight the next election, but frankly, it was a little reminder that the people who are really in charge of the Conservative Party are the men in grey suits. The problem is that, as the Conservative Home poll today showed, the party is completely split on who could possibly take over. We had a bit of silly season stuff on Jacob Rees-Mogg. Boris is seen as sort of a bit down in the dumps at the moment. So Theresa is safe, really, as long as there's not a star contender to try and take the crown. So I think she's got a little while, and no one really wants to pick up the, while not poisoned, certainly complicated mantle of Brexit. Many senior Conservatives feel that let Theresa do Brexit, get it out of the way, and then have a clean start before the next election.
Oh, and who do you think that Labour would be most concerned about as far as the next leader of the Conservative Party is concerned?
Oh, definitely Jacob Rees-Mogg. I would definitely elect him.
I remember this is what they said about Corbyn.
I have nightmares. I wake up in the night in cold sweats about Jacob Rees-Mogg. Please, Tory members, definitely. I'm not being sarcastic. I think the problem is with Theresa May at the moment is she's been used as a human shield she's kind of being held hostage by the Conservatives in the sense that the kind of view is let her take the anger and the resentment and the fury, and then when the time is right, depose her and find someone else. What's keeping her there is the lack of any obvious alternative within the Conservative Party, a fear of an early election, because it's kind of taking the mick a bit if you end up with a Prime Prime Minister who never stood an election for 5 years. We're not talking about like Gordon Brown, who came in after 2 years, or going back to John Major after 3 years. We're talking, straight after one election and then taking the Tories into election 2022.
Oh, but Owen, your boy had a go and he lost. He lost. As far as you're concerned, Labour should have been in power now. They're not. He lost.
No, Labour was obviously in a pretty sticky position back in April. Let's just be honest. Look, come on. All the odds were stacked against Labour. They won 24% in the opinion polls, and because in that election it was only they didn't have enough time. If it had gone on for another couple of weeks, I think they would have won actually. But actually, because of the policies, because of the manifesto, I know it did feel like a long time. I grant that, Harry. But if it had gone on longer, the momentum, in every sense, was with Labour. And I think we saw the biggest increase Labour has had in any election since 1945, from 30 to 40% in 10 years. So they came a lot closer to government. I mean, back in 2015 in that leadership race, none of the candidates were seriously talking about winning the next general election. They thought of betting a position where they could win after that, because Labour had a terrible election feat in 2015. It was like 1983. But in terms of the Conservatives, at the moment, Jacob Rees-Mogg is, according to the Conservative Home survey of the grassroots, now the leading candidate. He's the favourite. Boris Johnson's nowhere. And I would just suggest, it's up to the Tories, never interrupt your opponent when they're making a mistake, etc. But look, young people have turned... There's a 52-point lead for Labour amongst 18 to 24-year-olds. Do you really think a charming bloke, there he is, but an opponent of equal marriage, he might as well be the 19th century in human form? Is that really the solution to Tory woes? I mean, it's up to you, your funeral, but it just, it's odd. There's a lack of understanding.
We're going to leave these two talking, and we'll see you in an hour. Nicola Sturgeon, she today confirmed the public sector pay cap is to be scrapped in Scotland, increasing the pressure on the Prime Minister, Theresa May, to do the same south of the border. 5 million public sector workers have had their pay rises limited to 1% for the last 7 years, but scrapping the cap will cost billions. Joining us now is Sam Tarry, former advisor to Jeremy Corbyn, Sean Worth, former advisor to David Cameron. Sam, let's start with you. It was in the manifesto, but although it wasn't costed in the manifesto particularly, it was predicted to cost something like £9 billion a year.
I think the key issue for me is that since 2010, most public sector workers, and this is nurses, this is the firefighters that ran into Grenfell Tower to save people's lives, this is policemen keeping us safe every day. These people have not actually had a pay increase anywhere near inflation in any of those years. And so it actually means for the median average public sector worker, they've actually now had a near enough, just under £4,000 equivalent decrease in wages. And I just happen to think that that's incredibly unfair for the people that are risking life and limb, the people that are the backbone of our country's infrastructure, to have not had a pay rise. It just seems completely outrageous, really. So I think most of the public, and clearly at the last election, Labour's manifesto turned out to be very popular indeed. And a lot of Tories will be thinking, hold on, why did so many middle class people, why did so many people who work in the public sector shift from voting Conservative to voting Labour? And I think they've done that on the basis of Labour saying, this is totally unfair. The people that caused the banking crash, that remember Cameron and Osborne and co said meant that we needed austerity, were not public sector workers. They weren't binmen, they weren't nurses, they weren't firefighters, they weren't policemen or teachers. It was the out-of-control City of London and the spivs and the speculators of the square mile. And so from my point of view, I think the vast majority of the population think it's time we gave these people some relief and at least allowed their wages to come up to the level of inflation. Inflation's now at 3.7%. I mean, that's a big pay cut in real terms for people.
So, Sean, it was a Labour initiative, and the Tories realise they're on the back foot, and so that's why they've adopted it.
I think politically it's the right thing to do. I'd agree with Sam on that point. However, all the rest of the rhetoric around it, sort of evidence-free, remove the cap, don't talk about how much it costs, and all that is nonsensical. You have to do it in a sensible way. I mean, the proper way to do this. I mean, I agree. Nurses should get a pay rise. I think firefighters should do. Some of their bosses should get paid less, particularly in the NHS, where they're all off moonlighting for private sector firms and on huge salaries. But, you look at this properly, you can't just remove the cap and then start arguing for whacking up the public sector pay bill across the board, which is what the trade unions will do, I promise you. What you need to do to make it affordable and sensible and fair is look at it properly. And in places like Burnley, you've got public sector workers on the same wages as you have in Trafford, where the cost of living is literally stratospherically higher. A public sector worker in Trafford will have to pay, on average, about 15 times their salary to buy the average priced home. So clearly, you've got to have a proper review of the situation. You need some reform. You don't just remove the cap and whack the bill up, is my central point.
Sam, response to that, if you would?
Yeah, I actually agree. I think that there is a genuine debate to be had about, the part of the country you're in versus the amount of wages you're paid. I think, though, that most people in probably, as you said, the trade union movement would potentially oppose that, because actually we could create quite quickly a two-tier workforce or three-tier workforce right across the country. The thing for me that would be more important is actually to say, look, inflation is now so far outstripping. People are struggling to actually meet the most basic kind of bills. So I think it's not about just lifting it and just sort of saying, right, we're going to give everyone a 20% pay rise. I think we're saying actually, pay should be incrementally increased, but much closer to the level of inflation. Potentially even some remedial work should be done to actually bring those wages back in line. Because remember, it's not right that you're now paid less essentially than you were 7 years ago if you're a nurse or a teacher.
Yeah. Sean, it's all down to that George Osborne, isn't it?
Well, he was the one that capped public sector pay in the first place, but it was in the coalition government, which I worked in, which did it in 2010 to put a restraint, a brake on the escalation of cost in the public sector, while essentially the public sector was being slimmed down, and they were trying to increase productivity to make it more efficient. That's a sort of separate thing. But just to pick up on the one point that was made there about trying to create you can't have different rates of pay because you'll create 2 tiers or 3 tiers or whatever of workforces. This is the big argument and the big lie of the trade unions and the left, that that somehow the public sector workers have to be treated as the same block of people. And you have got small increments of extra money you can pay people who live in London, for example, where there's a real crisis of trying to get people to work in hospitals, for example. But it's a nonsense to say you can't pay somebody in Burnley less than you can in Stoke or York, where the cost of living is just massively higher. And in the public sector, in the third sector, and charity sector, you don't get a national pay bargain, which is what happens with trade unions and public sector, about you taking up a job. It reflects local needs and local labour markets. And it's just unfair that a public sector worker in Burnley, which has the lowest cost of living in England, is one of the wealthiest people in the town, because their wages are just too, they're outstripping everyone else in the locality.
Gentlemen, we're out of time, but it's good of you to take the time to speak to us here on Sky News this afternoon. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Scotland's First Minister has set out her party's programme for government for the coming year. Nicola Sturgeon placed education and health reform at the top of the agenda and says she'll lift the 1% cap on public sector pay rises. Ms Sturgeon called the plans fresh, bold and ambitious, but was accused by Conservative leader Ruth Davidson of over-promising and under-delivering. Our Scotland editor Sarah Smith is at Holyrood for us this evening. Sarah.
Politics here have been so dominated this year so far by arguments over a second Scottish referendum. Nicola Sturgeon is now trying to turn the page. She knows she needs to show she is energetically attacking problems in Scotland's schools and hospitals, not just worrying about independence. So she's come up with a very long list of measures for this parliamentary year. Nicola Sturgeon has got her hands full and she wants all of us to know it. She promised to refresh her policies after a disappointing general election result. Now she wants to seize back the political initiative with what she calls a bold and ambitious programme for government.
At its heart is this ambition: to make our country the best place in the world to grow up and be educated, the best place to live, work, visit and do business, the best place to be cared for in times of sickness, need or vulnerability, and the best place to grow old.
The First Minister announced significant government investment in high-tech manufacturing and financial technology, and she was getting her own lesson today in digital skills. But it's education that will be the biggest test for the SNP. Faced with falling standards in Scottish schools, they plan to give head teachers more powers and responsibilities.
What do we want? Fair
Teachers, along with nurses and police officers, will be among thousands of workers getting a higher pay rise next year, as Scotland's scrapping the 1% public sector pay cap. No details on how that might be paid for yet, but a strong hint higher income taxes may follow.
Given the parliamentary...
The opposition say the SNP have to earn back the trust of the Scottish electorate.
They must be frank about the huge challenges that Scotland faces and not seek as its first response to bury bad news and pretend it doesn't exist. Given what we know of this government, we will wait to see whether today's warm words are backed up by action before making a judgment. But the government should know this. After this last year, it is on probation with the people of Scotland. It is time to change tack and it is time to deliver.
The Scottish Parliament will certainly be busy, with 16 new bills announced today, including the creation of a national investment bank for Scotland, free personal care for under 65 suffering from dementia, a deposit return scheme for plastic bottles, and pardons for men convicted of same-sex offences, which are now legal. The Scottish Government also want to go further, faster with electric cars, promising a huge expansion of car charging facilities and plans to phase out new petrol vehicles by 2032, 8 years ahead of the UK target. But remember, as a minority government, the SNP need the support of other parties if they're to drive ahead these plans for the next year. Sarah Smith, BBC News, Edinburgh.